Guess who's back? Guess who's back on YouTube? I feel like if we had the rights to Eminem right now, we could use, one of his songs. You know which one. But we don't. So you'll just have to have the song playing in your head while I'm speaking. Yes, we are back on YouTube for the US Open here in Indianapolis. Very excited to bring you the content this week. Big week. US Open. It's always a big week. And I'm feeling pretty good. I've had a great off season. Bowled pretty well last week, and I'm feeling pretty good this week. So it's always a challenge here, and the US Open having multiple oil patterns, which Jillian will throw up on the screen like right about now. Those 4 patterns are difficult. They're not a lot of fun, but that's what you expect when you come to the US Open. So tonight is my first squad. I'm in the C squad. There have been 2 other squads already bowled. And actually the scoring pace is probably a little higher than most people were expecting. A couple of rules. No urethane this year. USBC has decided to ban urethane for the US Open, which makes me laugh because, and I've been saying this to a bunch of other fellas, is if they ban urethane, we will just throw plastic. And that's exactly what's been going on. Some huge games with plastic balls already. I think we've had a perfect game with plastic, a bunch of 270s and 280s with plastic, which is, I think, part of the reason why the scoring pace is higher than we anticipated, was because these plastic balls are actually doing the job. So tonight it's 40 foot, I believe. Yeah, I think it's 40 feet, maybe 41, no, 40 feet. And then there's a 47 or a 45. I don't even know. Actually, I'm terrible at this stuff. I find out the information I need when I bowl on them, to be honest. But that's the first rule, no urethane. So let me get back on track. Second rule, you're only allowed 10 balls for the tournament. And you have to check those 10 balls in before you start. So we had practice yesterday, which unfortunately Jillian couldn't get here in time for. But we bowled in all the patterns. I was able to select the 10 bowling balls, and those are the 10 that you're stuck with. So that makes it a little bit more challenging on top of the oil patterns as well. What else? I think there's 3 to a pair, 8 game blocks. I think that's about it. So literally driving into the to the car park now. Gonna get my shoes on. Oh, one more rule, which maybe you do know or you don't know, but here at the US Open, there is also no practice on the pairs. So they have a kind of like a range, and we get 25 minutes on the range. The whole squad bowls on 10 lanes down the other end of the building, so you can warm up, and then I think you get 1 or 2 shots. I think 1 on each lane when you go to your starting pair, and then that's it. You're straight into it after that. So yeah, it's this the US Open has changed so much throughout the years. It can be a little bit complicated to follow along, but this is what we got. This is what we have. Still just as prestigious as ever. So engine off. Let's head inside. Good to see you again. Okay, so out of the gates, 57 with the plastic ball up the lane. It's a good start. I kind of feel like probably could move in a little bit. Just watching Riley bowl this game now, and he's moved in a little bit and he looks pretty good. But, until this thing stops working, we'll stick with it for a little longer. that doesn't work, it's going back in the bag. Alright, we made our spares. It was a little bit tricky, that head had a little bit more hook really early, even with a plastic ball. Tried to give it away, it didn't really shape right. But I caught a double and I thought I could get a couple more at the end there, so 190, not the end of the world. Saved a game because it could have been worse. But I think it's time for us to move a little further left. Maybe move to the concept now and just still try to see that blend. But yeah, we can get away from the plastic a bit now. Alright, we can probably go back and just delete everything that I just said because Schlem, Krishna, tour rep here, has informed me that nobody has actually played outside on this pair. So it was a bit more fresh. So I was thinking maybe I don't see that early hook, and that shot there, it just floated through the first 12 feet. So maybe we stick with it for another game, maybe. This is where a little bit of experience is going to come in. I think my instinct normally would be, alright, let's just change board, jump left, see what happens. But I did that in a fill shot with the concept. I left a split. This is only the third game, so I know I'm going to eventually move left. And I think if I wait just one more game, figure this out with this ball right now, and just kind of play the more patient game, I may not shoot 250, but I can roll, a very solid score if I make a couple of moves and let the lanes kind of develop a little more before making that move. So I think that's what I'm going to do. Just stay a little patient and then trust myself. Alright, well that plan didn't quite work as well as we wanted. But we bowled 190, 180 when we, you don't know, maybe you change to reactive, move a little left, could have bowled 150, 150. So we'll lick our wounds. Just made a move now to the concept, just to move in a little bit, just kind of roll it a bit more. First shot looks pretty good. So now we just got to hope the next lane looks just as good, and we'll see how we go. Frustrating. Could have been a good game, and yeah, we just missed that 9-pin. Very careless, but I was shocked that that plastic ball hooked that much. So there's a lot of friction, which is good for your strike ball because you can throw it at it. So we're going to regroup, let that one go. 220, still a good game. If we shoot 220 for the rest of the tournament, we'll win it. So I'm okay with it. couple of 220s. Like I said, keep on 220 for the rest of the tournament, I'll win it. Really good 10th frame. Couple of shots like that. That's the thing about this house in particular. It can really fry you out, because some of those shots you think to yourself, and that should strike, and it just doesn't strike. And this is what this house does. So you kind of just got to lick your wounds, like I said before, and not get too, like, your rev rate in your head can't be fluctuating. It's just got to be idling and just kind of, yeah, stay patient through the day. Don't know how I feel about that last game. It felt higher than that, but I'm also very grateful to get that. So clutch 9th and 10th, 216. I suppose we have to take it. There's nothing I can do about it. But yeah, I think pretty much now for the rest of the night, this is what I'm going to be doing. Maybe we need to change balls. But I'm certainly hoping I don't have to, and this ball just keeps doing the right thing. Could have been a little better. A couple of crappy breaks, a couple of shots I should have regrouped and restarted when didn't feel comfortable in the approach, but 220, like I said, just 220 average for the rest. I'll be happy. Okay, overall, probably a B-. Felt like there was a few games that it took me a few frames to figure out the pair, and then when I did figure it out, sorry, I'm tripping over my own bags here. When I did figure it out, I just couldn't string the strikes. A bunch of 9 pins, a couple of other stubborn pins, but yeah, ultimately I feel like I could have bowled a little better, and if I had a little love, it could have been a really good score tonight. But yeah, 100 and whatever it is, 120 over, definitely not dead. Yeah, B+, no, B-. Yeah, B+ if I had have spared the 2 nuts. I can't believe I missed 2 nuts. I don't even know how, but I did. Can't do that anymore. Anyway, that's round 1 in the books for the US Open. Alright, I'm just trying to let go of what just transpired. yeah, I'll be. I think I'll feel better about tonight when I wake up tomorrow. But a little heated inside right now because it really could have been a good block. But that's bowling. G'day, thanks for watching. If you loved this one, check out the rest of the videos from this playlist or any other playlist. Make sure that you like the video and please subscribe if you would love to be the first to catch any of the latest of the behind the scenes and a whole lot of other cool stuff.